Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America, by Barbara Mcquade. Narrated by Barbara Mcquade. To all of the brave American heroes who've given their lives to defend democracy from fascism, a trip to Normandy, where more than 9,000 American service members are buried, left me in awe of their courage and selflessness. We owe them and other American patriots our vigilance, so that their sacrifices will not have been in vain. All warfare is based on deception. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Introduction. Disinformed to death. The information war is about territory, just not the geographic kind. In a warm information war, the human mind is the territory. René DiResta, The Digital Maginot Line. On January 5th, 2021, Roseanne Boyland left her home in Kennesaw, Georgia, for the 10-hour drive to Washington, D.C. Boyland had fallen under the spell of the election denier movement, bound by a belief that the incumbent president, Donald J. Trump, had won the presidential election, but had been robbed of his victory through fraud. In fact, 61 courts and Trump's own Justice Department had already rejected every claim of fraud, and federal cybersecurity and election officials had declared the 2020 election the most secure in U.S. history. The next day, Boyland joined a mob egged on by Trump and stormed the U.S. Capitol to "Stop the Steal," as the movement slogan went. Of course, as we all know by now, the crowd breached police lines, smashed windows, and broke into the building where Congress was meeting to certify the count of electoral votes from each state, the final procedure that would seal the presidential victory for Joe Biden. Boyland found herself on the west side of the Capitol, in a tunnel near a door guarded by police. As described by the New York Times, the crowd massed together in a dangerous crush, and then used the weight of their combined bodies to push the officers back, trapping many people in the process. At some point, Boyland fell to the ground, but the crowd did not relent. In all of the chaos, no medical professional could render timely aid, and, within a few hours, Boyland would be pronounced dead. Witnesses say Boyland was trampled to death. Her official cause of death was an amphetamine overdose, but a medical examiner said a contributing factor to her death was the raucous scene. Her sister later said Boyland would not have been at the Capitol at all that day if it weren't for all the misinformation. Like the rest of America, Boyland had been bombarded with the false claims that Biden had used fraud to steal the election, a fabrication that would become known as the Big Lie. 8 others would also lose their lives as a result of the Capitol attack that was sparked by the deluge of disinformation. Ashley Babbitt, a Trump supporter and U.S. Air Force veteran, was shot to death by Capitol Police when she tried to climb through a broken window and breach the Speaker's lobby. U.S. Capitol Police officer Brian Sicknick died after being attacked by rioters with chemical spray. In addition to the physical injuries suffered by 150 police officers, they and many others also suffered trauma that left unseen emotional scars. 4 officers committed suicide following the attack. And yet, more than a year later, 68% of Republicans were still deceived by lies that the 2020 presidential election had been stolen. Was this abhorrent attack on the temple of our democracy the final act that would break the fever that had gripped the country during the Trump administration? Or was it instead the beginning of the end of American democracy? Even after Trump was indicted by a special counsel in 2023 for his efforts to steal the election, the threat persists because, as journalist Barton Gellman wrote in The Atlantic, Trump and his party have convinced a dauntingly large number of Americans that the essential workings of democracy are corrupt, that made-up claims of fraud are true, and that only cheating can thwart their victory at the polls, that tyranny has usurped their government, and that violence is a legitimate response. In 2022, former federal judge J. Michael Luttig, a prominent conservative, warned that 2020 was merely a dry run to steal future elections. He called Trump and his allies a clear and present danger to U.S. democracy. Indeed, after Trump was charged with crimes for his efforts to upend the 2020 election, he began telling a second big lie, that the indictments were themselves election interference, filed solely to prevent his election to the presidency in 2024. Is our democracy ultimately destined for the same fate as Boyland, Babbitt, and Sicknick? Death by disinformation? Will America become a country where losing candidates refuse to concede elections, using lies to spark vigilante violence and impose their will? What if, as Gelman suggests, January 6 was practice, and Republicans are much better positioned to subvert the next election? What if Gelman's right, and their next effort succeeds? Or is American democracy undergoing a slower erosion, invisible in real time, but as devastating as a metastasizing cancer? Even if our form of government is not destroyed altogether, it risks becoming unrecognizable, controlled not by the people at large, but by a small faction of the far right, willing to say or do anything to seize power. And while the current purveyors of disinformation do not represent every member of the GOP, the party's silence is a form of complicity. When Republican leaders like former Congresswoman Liz Cheney denounce their party's disinformation, they're ignored or purged. Now that the potency of disinformation has been revealed, this weapon can be used by any demagogue or self-interested opportunist, regardless of political affiliation. The power of disinformation. Disinformation is the deliberate use of lies to manipulate people, whether to extract profit or to advance a political agenda. Its unwitting accomplice, misinformation, is spread by unknowing dupes who repeat lies they believe to be true. In America today, both forms of falsehood are distorting our perception of reality. In a democracy, the people need a shared set of facts as a basis to debate and make decisions that advance and secure their collective interests. Differences of opinion and even propaganda have always existed in the United States. But now, enemies of democracy are using disinformation to attack our sovereign right to truthful information, intellectual integrity, and the exercise of the will of the people. Online disinformation is particularly insidious because of its immediacy, its capacity to deceive, and its ability to reach its target. In February 2022, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security issued a threat bulletin warning of an online environment filled with false or misleading narratives and conspiracy theories, and other forms of mis, dis, and malinformation, MDM, introduced and or amplified by foreign and domestic threat actors. The bulletin stated that these threat actors seek to exacerbate societal friction, to sow discord, and undermine public trust in government institutions to encourage unrest, which could potentially inspire acts of violence. As technology continues to advance, the threat of disinformation looms even larger. Disinformers deliberately inflame our passions and demonize their political opponents to artificially limit options to only two perspectives on an issue. Debaters refer to this tactic as the either-or fallacy. And when one side is portrayed as good and the other as evil, the choice is easy. You must be for either the Trump-supporting right or the rivals they frame as the radical left. There will always be those who get taken by the P.T. Barnums and Bernie Madoffs among us. But now there's something more at work than simply gullible people falling for lies. A significant number of Americans don't seem to care anymore whether a statement's true. What seems to matter instead is whether any given message is consistent with their worldview. If a lie supports their position, some people seem willing to go along with the con and pretend it's true. When Donald Trump was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of illegally retaining classified national defense documents, for example, his defenders parroted Trump's claims that he was being attacked for political reasons. On the day of Trump's arraignment, Representative Elise Stefanik, a Republican from New York, said, "God bless America, President Trump, and all those targeted by Biden's regime as we continue our efforts to end this corrupt political weaponization and stop the deep state." We're not just living in a post-truth world. We're living in a post-shame world. Trump and his supporters consistently turn the tables on his accusers, not to convince people that he's innocent, but to suggest that everyone is corrupt. Integrity is for phonies and suckers, their thinking seems to go. And if everyone's corrupt, then you might as well choose the leader who shares your vision for America. Even those who don't fall for this logic are harmed by it. The risk to the rest of us is that we become cynical about politics. It's easy to grow weary of relentless arguments and aggression and choose to simply tune out. But when we disengage from public discourse, we surrender a piece of our power to the disinformers. The ultimate result over time is a weakened democracy, diminished national security, and a threat to the rule of law. America is under attack at this very moment, but not from any external enemy. The attack is from within. How has American democracy come to this, and why now? Part of the equation is recent technological advances. Before the information age, geographic regions in the vast territory of the United States set their own community standards. Immigration patterns and local history shaped the culture of various regions, each of which had its own set of widely shared values. In his eye-opening book, American Nations, journalist and historian Colin Woodard describes the cultural history of the United States. According to Woodard, there isn't and never has been one America, but rather several Americas. American identity in the Deep South is different from American identity in New York or on the West Coast. Some regions are more segregated than others, resulting in fewer interactions among people of different races, ethnicities, and religious faiths. It's easier to fear someone you've never met. And even within regions, people living in rural areas have different experiences and viewpoints than do those living in urban communities. In parts of the American West, for example, children grow up from an early age learning to use guns for hunting, competing in marksmanship, and protecting livestock from predators. Children who grow up in urban areas, on the other hand, may perceive guns as deadly weapons used to intimidate and kill people. Our varying experiences and cultural norms shape our individual visions of America. Today, the internet shoves all the versions of America in our faces. Our digital connections bring constant visibility to events occurring in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. The community standards of one region of the United States can seem outrageous in another. As former President Barack Obama said in a 2022 speech on technology at Stanford University, 40 years ago, if you were a conservative in rural Texas, you weren't necessarily offended by what was going on in San Francisco's Castro district because you didn't know what was going on. This new access to information can be jarring or even frightening to some people, amounting to what Obama called a direct affront to their traditions, their belief systems, their place in society. And so when someone in one region sees someone from a different region saying America is a Christian country or promoting drag queen story hour, they may perceive a threat to their way of life. The other part of the equation is manipulation. Some politicians prey on these fears, using disinformation to advance their personal and party ambitions. They know that when information conflicts with one's viewpoint, some people will accept distortions of fact rather than change their minds. The black man who was elected president can't be a legitimate leader, they argue, so he must have been born outside the United States, disqualifying him from office. A lingering pandemic would weaken the economy and make re-election of the incumbent less likely. So he says it will go away by Easter. No one voted for Biden because he's a socialist, some claim, and so the election must have been rigged. It can be easier to accept lies than to confront truths that make us uncomfortable. This book documents the ways that political opportunists and profiteers use disinformation as a weapon. The far right is not alone in spreading disinformation, and this tool can be used by any political party or faction. During the 2022 election, for example, a photo of Mehmet Oz, the television host who became the GOP candidate for Senate in Pennsylvania, was the subject of a fake internet meme showing him on his hands and knees kissing a certain star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. In fact, the photo was taken of him kissing his own star on the day it was added to the walk. But the meme had been altered to make it appear that he was instead kissing the star of Donald Trump. But at this moment, the most egregious purveyors of disinformation in U.S. politics are far-right members of the Republican Party. Currently, rather than call out lies, a large number of Republicans amplify them, or they silently indulge disinformation to advance their own careers and policy goals. Some conservative news media outlets promote falsehood for ratings and profit, further exacerbating the threat. In 2023, a lawsuit by Dominion Voting Systems exposed the duplicity of executives and hosts at Fox News, the cable network that pushed election conspiracy theories on air, even as insiders at the network privately acknowledged the falsity of claims that voting machines had flipped votes from Trump to Biden. As is now well known, the false claim of mass fraud was not a good faith challenge to a contested election. It was the most brazen disinformation campaign in American history. Fox paid a $787.5 million settlement for defaming Dominion because its coverage of the purported fraud was all a lie. If Fox learned any lesson from the lawsuit, it was short-lived. 2 months later, when Trump was charged in the classified documents case, Fox showed Biden above a graphic that read, "Wannabe dictator speaks at the White House after having his political rival arrested." According to the first two findings of the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, 1. Beginning election night and continuing through January 6th and thereafter, Donald Trump purposely disseminated false allegations of fraud related to the 2020 presidential election in order to aid his effort to overturn the election and for purposes of soliciting contributions. These false claims provoked his supporters to violence on January 6th. 2. Knowing that he and his supporters had lost dozens of election lawsuits, and despite his own senior advisors refuting his election fraud claims and urging him to concede his election loss, Donald Trump refused to accept the lawful result of the 2020 election. Rather than honor his constitutional obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, President Trump instead plotted to overturn the election outcome. The coup attempt was a breathtaking effort to subvert U.S. democracy and the will of the American people. Even though Trump left office in 2021, his movement to Make America Great Again, MAGA, lives on. For some, America was great when white men were in charge and everyone else knew their place. Leaders of the MAGA movement continue to focus on cultural divides to distract middle and lower income voters from economic policies that enrich the wealthy. Since the end of World War II, Americans have been less likely to earn more money than their parents. Since the Reagan administration, wealth disparities have grown dramatically. Income tax rates for top earners have fallen, and overseas manufacturing and automation have reduced the availability of blue-collar jobs. If people of color, immigrants, woke leftists, and a deep state of elite bureaucrats can be blamed for their problems, then some voters will tolerate or even embrace policies that go against their own financial interests. Disinformation researchers at the University of Texas have found that since 2010, many online influence campaigns have used communities of color as pawns, as both subjects and targets of disinformation. As Boston Globe columnist Kimberly Atkins Storr wrote following the release of the January 6 committee's report, a driving force behind the attack was race. Like many things involving the history, laws, and founding principles of our nation, she wrote, the attack had everything to do with race. It was no coincidence that Confederate flags, insignias of white supremacist groups, and a lynching noose were on display during the attack. One rioter wore a sweatshirt that said Camp Auschwitz, a horrifying anti-Semitic reference to Nazi death camps. In many ways, the attack was as much an expression of white nationalist identity as it was an attempt to seize power. Some Republican voters likely didn't care whether the election was stolen. Instead, what seems to have mattered more to them was installing the administration whose narratives best reinforced their own hopes, fears, and privileges. Long after Trump's claims of a stolen election have been debunked, the assault on truth continues. Under the pretext of rampant voter fraud, states have passed laws making it more difficult to vote. GOP candidate Kari Lake refused to concede defeat in the 2022 election for governor of Arizona, baselessly claiming that her race was one of the most dishonest elections in the history of Arizona, a position she had previewed even before the election. Her legal challenges to the election failed. While election deniers were largely defeated in the 2022 elections, two, one in Wyoming and one in Indiana, were elected Secretary of State, a position in which they would oversee their state's elections. Election deniers have become GOP party chairs in 3 states. George Santos, the Republican from New York, was elected to Congress after fabricating his education and employment history, ethnicity, volunteer work, and even a claim that his mother had died in the September 11th attacks. Then House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, a Republican from California, supported the embattled congressman even after a head-spinning amount of disinformation had been exposed, normalizing Santos's lies by noting that a lot of people in Congress fabricate their resumes. Santos was later indicted for fraud and false statements. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis continues to stoke the culture wars, leading a ban in schools on books and discussions about race, gender, and sexuality, calling his state where woke goes to die. After the January 6 committee concluded its probe into the attack in December of 2022, the new Republican majority that took control of the House in January 2023 created a subcommittee to study the weaponization of government investigations based on a claim that conservatives had been unfairly targeted. The subcommittee promised to give life to the lie that government investigations into Trump's corruption had been witch hunts and hoaxes all along. Chaired by Representative Jim Jordan, Republican from Ohio, the subcommittee also investigated the criminal charges filed against Trump by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg in 2023 over fraudulent business documents and the RICO election interference case against Trump and 18 co-defendants filed by Fulton County District Attorney Fani T. Willis in Georgia. The subcommittee even investigated academic researchers who study disinformation. By fall of 2023, it appeared that their efforts were having a chilling effect on disinformation research. The National Institutes of Health paused its $150 million program devoted to improving the communication of accurate medical information, including vaccines, based on threats of legal actions. After Stanford University's Election Integrity Partnership was accused of working with the government to censor online speech, and right-wing advocate Jack Posobiec threatened to leave it penniless and powerless, the founder of the university's Internet Observatory program said it would have to reconsider its involvement in the project. The assault on truth is far from over. Diagnosing the problem. I wrote this book hoping to spark a national conversation about the danger of disinformation and how we can defeat it. Throughout history, authoritarians have used disinformation to seize power from the people. As a former national security prosecutor, I see self-serving forces sabotaging our country. Manipulators are using disinformation to poison discourse and stoke divisions in society. False statements on social media, posted under fake personas, and amplified by automated accounts, can make some people believe ridiculous lies, such as claims that Hillary Clinton sold weapons to ISIS, or that school districts were putting kitty litter in restrooms for students who identified as cats. Disinformation is designed to evoke a strong emotional response in order to push us toward more extreme views. And our outrage is not confined to digital spaces. Our communications online drive animosity in real life. Our country's constantly changing demographics naturally bring differences of opinion. But the bitter divides are not the inevitable result of a pluralistic society with diverse ethnic, racial, religious, and social groups. They are the product of a deliberate attack through disinformation. Lies are becoming increasingly normalized, and our democracy is in peril. The conversation I propose is not a debate about Democratic and Republican politics. It's about the essential need for truth in self-governance. Throughout our history, America has been targeted with disinformation from hostile foreign adversaries such as Russia, long the master of propaganda. In 1923, the young Soviet Union set up its first office for Desinformatia, or disinformation. Intelligence operatives crafted communications designed to deceive Western intelligence agencies by exaggerating Soviet military strength, and then sent them through the Estonian mission in Moscow, where the operatives correctly predicted the letters would be opened and read, and the false information shared with allies. In the early 1980s, at the dawn of the AIDS epidemic, the Soviets propagated the false story that the U.S. government had created the virus in a lab as a biological weapon. Ironically, one of the factors that makes us susceptible to disinformation is our nation's fundamental value of free speech. Federalist Paper number 63 warned us of the risk of being misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men. Since the days when people began telling the fable of George Washington confessing to his father about chopping down a cherry tree because he could not tell a lie, Americans have engaged in the spread of mythology and propaganda. Senator Joseph McCarthy's lies pushed the Red Scare. The invasion of Iraq was based on false claims about weapons of mass destruction, later blamed on faulty intelligence. Undeniably, the United States also engages in information warfare, using psychological operations, or PSYOPs, to manipulate foreign populations for strategic advantage. Although little is written about PSYOPs in the public domain, according to the U.S. Army's website, the American military uses psychological warfare to deliberately mislead enemy forces during a combat situation. The military also uses communication strategies to influence the emotions, motives, reasoning, and behavior of foreign governments and citizens. An important caveat of U.S. PSYOPs, however, is that they are not to be used on the American people. The current strain of falsehoods is altogether different. As a tactic relentlessly used today by a shrinking American political party to maintain a popular base, disinformation in the United States defrauds the American people. The profound damage it causes is not part of some far-off dystopian future. The harm is apparent here and now. This is a pivotal moment in our nation's history, and the stakes could not be higher. Legislation in a number of states is harming democracy by making it increasingly difficult to cast a ballot. Election suppression laws create obstacles to voting, such as limits on early voting, prohibitions on third-party assistance for delivering ballots, restrictions on voting by mail, and limits on the number and locations of ballot deposit boxes. These restrictions have a disparate impact on communities of color, young people, and the economically disadvantaged.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?